Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. In this talk, I'll be taking you through a recommendation system I built for finding new music called the Album Discoverer. It focuses on recommending albums rather than songs. But before we get to all that, let me introduce myself. My name is Angeline Protacio, and I'm a data scientist and epidemiologist. Public health is super exciting right now, and that's why I'm giving this talk over video rather than in person. I also enjoy working on side projects to learn about different domains, and I recently completed the Metis Data Science Bootcamp, where I completed several of these projects, including the Album Discoverer. I want to preface this talk by saying I'm not a musician, nor am I an expert on music theory. I am, however, a music appreciator, and I enjoy discovering new bands and albums. My appreciation is the foundation for this side project. To give you an overview of this talk, I'm going to start with my motivation for this project, followed by a discussion of the methods I used and an overview of my data sources. Then, I'll introduce and explore my features and explain how I used principal components analysis for dimensionality reduction and CoreX for genre validation. After that, I'll cover how I built the recommender with examples. I'll cap this off with a demo of the Flask app I built and limitations and directions for future work. All right, let's get started. To provide you with a little bit of context for this tool, I want to discuss the landscape of the current music recommendation systems. I'm an avid Spotify user, and I recognize how much of the platform relies on playlist creation. Whenever I log into Spotify, they have several playlists made for me, according to certain themes. Playlists are built at the track level, using songs that are similar to ones I've already listened to and liked, as well as songs that tend to go well together. These playlists work really well for introducing new artists to a broader audience. However, it's clear that something is lost when tracks are valued over albums. Musicians often conceptualize their work as an album with an intended track order and overarching themes that progress, and all of that is lost when songs are put into a playlist. A few examples of contemporary albums like this are Janelle Monáe's The Electric Lady, or Demon Days from Gorillaz. When I get tracks from either album in a playlist, I find it jarring when the song ends, and the next song is not what comes next on the album. I often just end the playlist, and I start up the album instead. I don't think this is the intended outcome. Given this difference in how tracks and albums are presented, I wanted to build a recommendation system that's album first, preserving the artist's thoughtfulness and consideration, and providing a more faithful experience for the listener, as the artist intended. To complete this project, I relied heavily on a few Python libraries, like requests in Beautiful Soup for web scraping, pandas in NumPy for data cleaning and processing, and then matplotlib and Seaborn for data visualization. I used scikit-learn for principal components analysis, CoreX for the genre dimensionality reduction, and Flask to make an interactive application to deliver the recommendations. And finally, I hosted the app on Google Cloud Platform's App Engine. To get my data, I started by scraping Metacritic for the top-rated albums of all time, generating a list of album titles and artists. I kept the first 11 pages of results, resulting in a total of 1,093 albums. Then I fed this list into the Spotify API to retrieve album, artist, and track information. Not all of the albums scraped from Metacritic had data available in Spotify, so I ended up losing something like 100 albums. But in the end, I was just shy of 1,000 at 992 albums. The Spotify API provides 13 features for each track, and I'll cover a few of them here. Danceability measures how suitable a track is for dancing, and the most danceable tracks in my data come from artists like Spoon, Cardi B, and MIA. Energy refers to the intensity and activity of a song, with the most energetic tracks in the data belonging to a noise rock band named Lightning Bolt. Speechiness measures the presence of spoken words, and it tends to be really high for tracks that have spoken intros or interludes. Not surprisingly, there are several rap albums that rank very high in speechiness. There's also Instrumentalness, which measures the absence of vocals on a track, and as I'd expect, a drone band named Mountains ranks highly for this. Liveness measures the presence of audience in the recording, and this feature is topped by tracks from Nirvana's Live at Reading album. Tracks from MIA and Spoon rank highly in Valence, which looks at music positiveness. And taken all together, these 13 features provide a general idea of the nature of each track. There's also an artist-level feature, genre, which I'll get back to a little later on in the talk. From these 13 track-level features, I wanted to do dimensionality reduction. I did this because I suspected that I didn't need all 13 features to distinguish tracks, and more features means sparse data, which can throw a wrench into my recommendation system. This is the curse of dimensionality, which is shown in this figure on the slide. As the number of features or dimensions increases, observations get further apart from each other. This makes it really hard to know and understand which data points are closest to each other. Given that, I scaled my features, which is definitely a must for this process, and I did a principal components analysis. This drops the components that explain the least amount of variance and extracts the most important features. There are a few ways to determine how many principal components to use. I plotted the cumulative explained variance and chose the number of components that explains 75% of the variance. This is the white dashed line on the plot. Based on this, 75% of the variance can be explained using 7 principal components. So I extracted the 13 features into 7 components for each track. Because I want to do my recommendation on the album level rather than on the track level, I need to somehow combine the data from all the tracks into album level data. There's a few ways to do this, and I chose the simplest one, averaging each component across all tracks for each album. By doing this, I've reduced a lot of track level features to get album level data, but it's not clear whether this album data describes the album well at all. I decided to plot the albums by genre to see if albums from the same genre would visually cluster near each other. This sounds easy enough, but it turns out that artist genres need a little bit of cleanup. You can see from this slide, each artist often has multiple genres listed. While the genres for Fiona Apple and Janelle Monáe are pretty reasonable descriptions of their music, this list needs to be simplified into one overarching genre in order to group each artist with other similar artists and plot them all together. To do this, I decided to do a little more dimensionality reduction using a tool called COREX. COREX is short for correlation explanation, and this method can illuminate underlying relationships in the data. It's often used for topic modeling. In this example, the genres for Fiona Apple, PJ Harvey, Bob Dylan, and Tom Waits are correlated. The singer-songwriter genre appears across all 4 artists. Lilith appears for both Fiona Apple and PJ Harvey, and you see folk rock and roots rock for Bob Dylan and Tom Waits. COREX identifies all of these similarities, and since these genres tend to appear together for each artist, it can put them all together into one overarching genre category 1, for lack of a better name. I used COREX to identify overarching categories from all 747 unique genres, and I ended up with 10 genre categories. I renamed them with the names shown here, plus a catch-all called Other, for artists who weren't assigned to any of the genre categories I listed. I did majority assignment, assigning the genre category with the highest probability to each album. I'll highlight 3 of these genre categories to demonstrate which genres ended up clustering together. This is a closer look at genre category 1 from an earlier slide, which I renamed to folk singer-songwriter. These genres are related to each other, so this grouping makes sense, especially for the artists I described earlier, Fiona Apple, PJ Harvey, Bob Dylan, and Tom Waits all make sense under this folk singer-songwriter category. The genre I've labeled hip-hop rap includes pop rap, funk, and soul. While I don't necessarily understand what makes the genres closely related, I can understand why they might be clustered together. Janelle Monáe's The Arc Android was assigned to this genre category. I labeled this genre metal classic rock, which includes drone metal, classic rock, and album rock. This grouping makes a bit of sense to me. This genre includes albums by David Bowie, the Deftones, and Robert Plant. Now each album is assigned to a genre category. Great, this means I can start plotting by genre. This plot is a T-SNE plot of the principal components. It shows the albums represented in a 2D space colored by genre. There's a lot here on this plot, so we're going to take it a little slowly, one at a time. Let's start with this red cluster on the far left. This is the cluster for albums with the genre category hip-hop and rap. There are a few stray albums at the bottom and maybe at the top, but it's generally clear that most albums are part of the cluster where the arrow's pointing. Now for the folk singer-songwriter genre category. You see the cluster in the bottom center. It's not a tight cluster by any means, but there are clear clusters for albums in this genre category, demonstrated by the arrow. And similarly, for the metal and classic rock genre category, albums have clustered near the top right of the plot. You can see the dance electronica albums near the middle right side of the plot. We're going to look at one more plot just to really hammer this in. So this is the experimental album plot, and you can see clearly that these albums are clustering in the bottom right, where the arrow is. Given the plots, it looks like albums from similar genres are clustering together. This is great. This gives me faith that the PCA and mean aggregation did not lose important feature information about the albums in general. Now that I know my components reasonably describe the albums they're intended to represent, I wanted to see how they distinguish between albums from the same artist. I decided to plot albums from a few different artists to explore this in greater detail. I started with Sleater-Kinney, who had 5 albums in the dataset. All 5 generally cluster near each other, except for this one, their Live in Paris album, which is the only live album of the 5. Given that one of the track features I mentioned earlier explicitly measures liveness, this probably explains why this album is far away from the others. This plot shows 2 of Janelle Monáe's albums in the data. They're separated, which makes sense if you're familiar with the albums. The Arc Android is a lot more alternative and psychedelic, whereas Dirty Computer is a bit more R&B and soul. Let's move on to Robin. In this plot, her 2 earlier albums are clustered near each other. This makes sense, since Body Talk and her self-titled are both a lot more dance-oriented, whereas her latest album, Honey, is really different. It's a lot moodier, so it makes sense that it's further away from the other 2. LCD Soundsystem's albums seem to cluster based on time period. The 2 on the left are their first 2 studio albums, and the second pair in the middle are later on in their career. This last one is an album that's just one 45-minute long track, which explains why it's separated from the others. And this last plot is for MIA, whose 2 albums on the list, Kala and Arular, are pretty similar, in my opinion, and this is consistent with what the plot shows. I'll also point out that her 2 albums are on the far left, which is where we saw hip-hop and rap albums clustering in an earlier slide. Spotify's genre for MIA is art pop, but personally, I'd consider her more of a rapper, and this is supported by this plot. It seems that the components are able to capture information that diverges from genre, which highlights the subjectivity of the genre category for each artist. At this point, I'm fairly confident that the aggregated components can reasonably represent albums, given the plots by genre category. I'm also confident that the components can group similar albums next to each other and separate dissimilar albums. Now it's time to get some album recommendations. To do this, I calculated the cosine distance between each album in the 7-dimensional space. Then, I selected the 5 albums with the largest cosine similarity to the reference album. This returns the 5 albums most similar to the referent. Let's look at a few examples which will clarify this. Using Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer as a reference returns these 5 albums on the bottom. Solange's A Seat at the Table has very similar themes to Dirty Computer, so this makes sense. The White Stripes' Elephant seems like a bit of a curveball, but I think there is similarity in the blues elements of both albums. And Saturn from Neo, second from the left, is an R&B album that shares some of the R&B elements in Dirty Computer. These aren't bad recommendations. Let's do one more. I picked the Go Team's Thunder, Lightning, Strike album, which is an incredibly varied album. The Go Team is considered an indie band, and this album features a lot of songs that are danceable, instrumental, and repetitive. I really like these 5 recommendations. Yellowcard's Southern Air is a pop-punk album that features guitar riffs that I find pretty similar to those on Thunder, Lightning, Strike. And Proto Martyr's Undercolor of Official Right is considered a post-punk album, and I think that some of the repetition in the Go Team album draws parallels to post-punk. The Royal Society is considered psychobilly, which mixes rockabilly and punk rock. Nirvana's Bleach is squarely in grunge territory. And Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots is often considered a space rock album. Having listened to all 5 of these albums, I find that there's many parallels between each of them to Thunder, Lightning, Strike. I'm not a music critic, so again, I lack some of the language to describe just how these albums are similar to each other. But personally, I think the recommender works well for such a varied reference album. Now that I'm pretty happy with the recommender, I've decided to put it all into a Flask app. This is the homepage of the app I made for the Album Discoverer. From here, you can get an album recommendation, or you can see a list of top albums for inspiration. If you want an album recommendation, you're prompted to start the recommender by entering an album and artist in the form. I'll enter in Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer to visualize the recommendations that we saw in a previous slide. You can see the White Stripes, Neo, and Solange all on that list. Let's try another. We'll go back to the input page and try a different album. Let's get a recommendation for Talking Heads for the album Once in a Lifetime. These are the top 5 results. This album shares some indie rock elements with the other 3 Spoon albums listed here. So to me, it makes sense to have them in the top 5. And the other 2 albums, Radio Sewell and Bouger Le Monde, show up probably because Talking Heads incorporates music from different cultures. Radio Sewell is about the American occupation of Haiti and features tracks influenced by Haitian folk songs, while Bouger Le Monde features tracks heavily influenced by Congolese dance music. These albums would be great additions to my library. If you find that you're lacking in inspiration and need a reference album, you can navigate to the top list and browse. Now that you've seen how it works, I want to note that there are a few limitations to the recommendation system. The first is that recommendation systems are imperfect, and not every single recommendation will be useful. Similar to how most of us don't click on every movie or show that's recommended by Netflix, some album recommendations will seem completely irrelevant to the input album. This is a known caveat to recommendation systems, and I'm perfectly fine with it, so long as some recommendations are still good. I also realize that using principal components analysis makes the components hard to interpret, So when there's a strange recommendation, it obscures which of the original 13 features were actually similar to the input album. To improve the interpretability, I'd be interested in trying this again, but keeping all 13 features to see how it impacts the recommendations. Finally, it's worth noting that this recommender is biased, based on the data that it uses. Certain genres and artists are well represented in the top 1,000 albums in Metacritic, whereas others are completely absent. It's possible to address this by adding the next 1,000 albums to the recommender, but this is hard to fix if only certain types of albums are being ranked highly on Metacritic. Additionally, because Metacritic was launched in 2001, as far as I can tell, it doesn't include any albums released prior to that, with the exception of albums that are re-released. Earlier albums aren't going to be recommended by the album discoverer, unless I choose to add from a different data source, which is an option for future work. There is more work to be done to improve the album discoverer, but this is not a bad start for a project that was completed in just a few weeks. Thanks for tuning in. I've included here the link to the actual Flask app, and I'd love for you to go and try it yourself. For the blog post and relevant code, if you want to build this yourself, I've included links to my portfolio as well as my GitHub account. Please reach out to me with feedback or questions about the album discoverer using the contact information listed here. Happy listening.